welcome to Truth for Life with Alistair Begg. In the next half hour, we'll focus on a question that has intrigued men and women for generations. Who is Jesus? Many in our days simply conclude that he was a moral man and a good teacher. But according to the New Testament, Jesus made claims about himself that make him so much more than that. Alistair Begg continues in John chapter 10 today with a message titled, Who is Jesus?
We said last time that the fundamental question was, did Jesus himself ever claim to be God? People will respond to our affirmations and protestations by saying, well, we understand that you believe him to be God, but we're not sure that he himself regarded himself as God. And so taking up the challenge, we addressed it, looking first of all last time at a number of the indirect claims which Jesus made to deity. We then proceeded from there to begin the first two of 6 direct claims made by Christ in addressing the whole question of the fact that he was both God and man. And having dealt with one in chapter 5 of John's Gospel and then in the 8th chapter of John's Gospel, we come now to the 10th chapter and particularly to verse 29 and the declaration which comes just in one simple sentence in verse 30. Jesus is speaking of the fact that he has sheep who listen to his voice. And in verse 29 he says of them, "My Father who has given them to me is greater than all. No one can snatch them out of my Father's hand. I and the Father are one." Now the word which is used there for one is not in the masculine, it is in the neuter. And it is significant insofar as the claim which Jesus was making was simply this, to be one in substance and essence with God the Father. And as a result of making that affirmation, he was met with a quite violent reaction. In verse 31, the Jews again picked up stones to stone him. And Jesus said to them, "I've shown you many miracles from the Father. For which of these do you stone me?" It was almost as if he wanted to elicit from them this response so as to underpin the claim which he had so clearly made. And he could not have been disappointed, for the reply in verse 33, "We are not stoning you for any of these," replied the Jews, "but for blasphemy, because you, a mere man, claim to be God." And still people walk the streets of Cleveland and say, well, I'm not sure that Jesus himself ever claimed to be God. And to that we should answer quite kindly and sincerely, well then let us look at the evidence together and see whether in fact he did. And in opening up the scriptures and in going through them, we come to these straightforward statements. The Jewish mind was in no way misled concerning what Jesus was claiming. Hence their response. Stoning was the justifiable reaction to blasphemy, and blasphemy was the claim on the part of any mere man to actually be God. And because they regarded Jesus as merely a man, they regarded his claim of oneness with the Father to be nothing other than blasphemy. Nevertheless, it is a direct claim on the part of Jesus. That's why we turn to it. In John chapter 14, turning forward, Jesus has declared to the disciples that he is the way and the truth and the life, and no man can come to the Father but through him. He then follows that up in verse 7 by saying, "If you really knew me, you would know my Father as well. And from now on you do know him and have seen him." Now clearly Jesus is making some reference to himself. Even a cursory glance at this makes that obvious. And while we might like to think that we would have immediately been tuned into it, the chances are that we may also have been responding as did Philip, because Philip responds and says, "Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us." And Jesus answered, "Don't you know me, Philip?" Now Philip's response, of course, was, "Yes, I know you." He didn't really understand. "Don't you know me, Philip, after I have been among you for such a long time? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, 'Show us the Father'?" Now, the interesting thing is that back in the Old Testament, in Exodus chapter 33, when God had spoken to Moses, he had made it clear to Moses, in verse 20, "You cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live." He then went on to say, "There is a place near me where you may stand on a rock, and when my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft in the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by. And then I will remove my hand, and you will see my back, but my face must not be seen." And so the Jewish mind grew up understanding this. There is no possible way that we will be able to actually see God face to face. And yet here is Philip saying, "Oh, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us." "Now," says Jesus, "understand this, Philip, and all the other Philips who come after you. In my own life and in my personality, I am revealing all of the nature and character of God that it is possible for a human being to see and to know." That's what he's saying. In me, Philip, if you're wondering about God, look at me. If you're wondering about the character of God and the nature of God, look at me. For I and the Father am one, and anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. And down through the corridors of time, Jesus addresses all who are interested to know God. And he says, "So you want to know God? Well, then look at me." And it is a surprise to me how many people have rejected Christianity, not as a result of having examined its claims and found them wanting, but as a result of never having examined its claims and simply rejecting it out of hand on the basis of conjecture and various pieces of scientific jargon. But the honest man, the real scientist, the genuine skeptic, the honest seeker in looking for spiritual reality must come against this eventual statement by Jesus, "Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father also." Turn forward to John chapter 17. And in his high priestly prayer, Jesus, in addressing the Father, says in verse 5, "And now, Father, glorify me in your presence with the glory that I enjoyed and had with you before this world even began." Jesus is there speaking of a glory that he'd known, not just at some time in the past, but as part of his eternal possession before the world even began. And the inevitable reaction to this is to say, who does this person think they are? I mean, who do you think you are? The glory you had before the world began. You mean you were there before the world began? In the presence of God the Father? You were there, Jesus? Yeah, I was. The sixth direct claim, and I've only chosen 6, we could go to other places. The sixth takes us into John chapter 18, where we have the record by John of the arrest of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Actually, in this olive grove, in verse 1, Judas, knowing the place, in verse 3, came to the grove guiding a detachment of soldiers. And some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. And then Jesus responds in just 2 words, "Ego eimi," which actually does not have in Greek the word he. He simply responds by saying, "I am." And verse 6 records that when Jesus declared himself as "I am," they drew back and fell to the ground. What in the world is going on? Here is an emotionally spent, unarmed individual in an olive grove. A crack detachment of troops are sent for his arrest. Men who are routine in this process, as routine as a doctor giving an injection or a school teacher putting something up on a blackboard. It was as routine to them as that. And they come to the garden in the prospect of just another arrest in the course of their days. Surely they all knew about this Jesus of Nazareth. Certainly he'd been a troublemaker in the city for some time. There were all kinds of statements being made against him, about him. And so finally they come to the garden, and instead of having to go scurrying for the individual as we might have expected, for example, if you thought you were within the prospect of crucifixion, do you think you would be walking out to the group as they came to find you, said, "Excuse me, were you looking for somebody?" No, you'd be buried somewhere. You would be hidden. I would be hidden. Up a tree, behind a tree, in a vault, in a tomb, anywhere to get away. But he walks forward and he said, "And who is it that you want?" And they say, "We want Jesus of Nazareth." And he says, "I am. I am." And the Marines fall to the ground. Why? They didn't believe any of this stuff. They weren't predisposed. They weren't hallucinating. They were just guys going about their business as usual. So what happened? Something of the divine glory and power and majesty and wonder of who Jesus is emanated from him even in that moment. And he asked a routine question, and he gave his reply, and they were flat on the ground. Well, those are some direct statements. You can find more. Let me go on from there, though, and ask a second question, because the first question we asked was, what did Jesus say? And we've looked at some of that. Selectively, not exhaustively. The second question is, what does it mean? Because we can read this, but how do we understand it? How do we process it and assimilate it? Now, let me give to you a number of statements. I'm going to give you now in the next few moments a crash course in historical theology. And I will give you stuff now that took me ages to try and understand. I do understand it. I hope I can say it, having understood it. But for you, you're getting the benefits of all my blood, sweat, and tears throughout the years, so that you can get it in one or two phrases that are understandable. What does it mean that Jesus made these claims to deity? Well, when we take all that we've looked at in John's Gospel, and we might just go back to the first place of beginning in John chapter 1 and the opening couple of verses, when we piece it all together, we begin to realize that Jesus is speaking of the fact of his eternity. Hence, the opening phrase of John's Gospel, "In the beginning was the Word." And this logos was understood both by the Jewish and Greek mind to be this essential creating principle. And, says John, the Word, whom he is going to identify as Jesus, was